Throughout history, only a few well-disciplined countries have not encountered debt crises. This is because lending is never done flawlessly due to how the cycle affects people's psychology to create bubbles and busts. While policymakers commonly try to perfect it, they often become too loose with credit because the short-term rewards of faster growth are appealing. That is the main reason we see big debt cycles. To understand debt cycles, we first need to understand debit and credit. Credit is the giving of buying power. This buying power is exchanged for a promise to pay it back, which is debt. If there's very little credit, then there's very little development, which is a bad thing. Credit creates both spending power and debt, so it's desirable if the borrowed money is used to generate enough income to service the debt. Most of what people think is money is really credit, and credit appears out of thin air during good times and disappears in bad times. This is an illusion that many people misinterpret. When you buy something on credit, you essentially do so by saying, "I promise to pay." If the store owner believes that he won't get paid, then he believes his credit asset isn't really there. In reality, it didn't go somewhere else, it's simply gone. The pattern of borrowing, spending more than you make, and then having to spend less than you make very quickly resembles a cycle. This is true for a national economy as it is for an individual. So what do people care about more? Illusion and fantasy, or truth and reality? We see that people often spend more than they make and pursue a speculative life. However, they consequently face a harsh reality. As these cycles have reoccurred over the past centuries and people perpetually overspend, perhaps people care more about illusions than fantasies. Or perhaps what people care about depends on the stage of the economy. In Ray Dalio's book, Big Debt Crises, he has broken down the stages of the deflationary cycle into 7 archetypes. The early part, the bubble, the top, the depression, the beautiful deleveraging, pushing on a string, and normalization. In the early part of the cycle, debt is not growing faster than incomes. Debt growth is being used to finance activities that produce fast income growth. The money that is borrowed may be going towards expanding businesses and making them more productive. Debt burdens are low and balance sheets are healthy. Debt growth, economic growth, and inflation are neither too hot nor too cold. This is the Goldilocks period. As time goes on, we enter the bubble of the cycle. Rising incomes, net worths, and asset values raise borrowers' capacities to borrow because these are what lenders use to determine how much they can lend. This set of conditions is not sustainable though because the debt growth rates increase faster than the incomes that will be required to pay them. The problem is that borrowers feel rich, so they spend more than they earn and buy assets at high prices with credit. Investors, business people, financial intermediaries, and policymakers increase their confidence in ongoing prosperity, which fuels the bubble. The boom is also encouraged by buyers who don't want to miss out on the action to enter the market. Eventually, the debts become too large in relation to the amount of money in existence there is to give. At this part of the cycle, people care more about illusion over truth as they're drawn to living their prosperous dream lives over anything else. The problem is that they're doing this on borrowed money. In many cases, monetary policy helps inflate the bubble rather than constrain it. These periods are typically interpreted to be a productivity boom and investors leverage to buy investment assets. Central banks are focused on inflation and growth, so they often are reluctant to tighten money. This is what happened in Japan in the late 1980s and much of the world in the late 1920s and mid-2000s. When prices have been driven by a lot of leveraged buying and the market gets fully long, leveraged, and overpriced, it reaches the top and is doomed for reversal. The top often occurs when the central bank starts to tighten and interest rates rise. Whatever the cause of the pop, lenders worry that they might not be able to get their cash back from those that they lent it to. Borrowers disappear as an increasing share of their new borrowing goes to pay debt services and their spending slows down. This is often because of overly optimistic people buying assets at high prices with credit. The riskiest debtors start to miss payments, lenders worry, credit spreads increase, and risky lending slows. Unemployment is normally at cyclical lows and inflation rates are rising. The increase in short-term interest rates make holding cash more attractive, which weakens the price of risky assets and slows lending. It also makes items bought on credit more expensive, which slows demand. When stock prices fall, people mistake the drop to be a buying opportunity, failing to account for the amount of decline in earnings that is likely to result from what's to come. As wealth falls first and incomes fall later, creditworthiness worsens, which decreases lending activity, which hurts spending and makes it less appealing to borrow and buy financial assets. This is an accelerating downward impact on asset prices, income, and wealth. After the bubble pops, the economy enters a depression. Unlike recessions, depressions can't cut interest rates since they have either already reached close to 0% or the floor in interest rates is higher because of credit or currency risk. As the depression begins, debt defaults and restructurings hit lenders like an avalanche. Since banks are typically leveraged about 12 to 1 or 15 to 1, that picture is obviously devastating for the economy as a whole. Fears in lending lead to downfalls of financial institutions that typically don't have enough cash unless they're under government protection. The ability to sell investments for money becomes a major concern. When a large number of people rush to sell their financial assets for money, the central bank either has to provide the cash by printing more money or allowing a lot of defaults. Lack of cash is a severe problem and triggers most debt crises. We clearly see how people care more about reality as opposed to illusion in this part of the cycle, as they fear the devastating consequences. Some people mistakenly think that depressions are psychological. Investors are not moving their money to safer investments because they're scared, and the economy will not be restored if they can be convinced to move their money back into riskier investments. Though psychology does have an effect, if everyone went to sleep and woke up with no memory of what had happened, we would still be in the same position. There are many ways to manage depressions. Policymakers may choose to provide a lot of guarantees, print a lot of money, and monetize a lot of debt, which lifts the economy. If they get the mix right, the depression is likely to be relatively short-lived, like the 2008 financial crisis. If they don't, the depression is usually prolonged, like the Great Depression. A beautiful deleveraging happens when the policymakers pull their levers in a balanced way to reduce breakdowns and produce positive growth. The economy needs enough stimulation through printing money to offset the deflationary deleveraging forces, but not too much, otherwise the currency is devalued and new debt bubbles arise. This is what would happen in a well-managed scenario. Central banks would closely manage growth and debt and its effects on asset markets during the bubble stage. Central banks must use policies to restrain debt growth where bubbles are emerging and allow debt growth where it is beneficial. At the top stage, central banks would constrict the bubble either with monetary or fiscal policies. During the depression stage, central banks would provide enough cash, decrease short rates quickly until they hit 0%, and then aggressively monetize. Governments would pursue fiscal stimulus and protect important institutions. In the beautiful deleveraging, asset purchases or big currency declines are needed. Stimulative policies would aim to protect systemically important entities and restore high-quality credit growth. Non-systemically important institutions are left to fail. Policymakers would balance the depressive forces with debt monetization, currency declines, and fiscal stimulus. Late in the long-term debt cycle, central bankers' policies struggle to increase spending. At this stage, the economy enters a period of low growth and low returns on assets, and central bankers move to other forms of monetary stimulation. When policymakers faced these conditions in the 1930s, they coined the phrase, pushing on a string. The central banks may use interest rate-driven monetary policy, quantitative easing, also known as printing money and buying financial assets, or simply put money directly into the hands of spenders and incentivize them to spend it. Eventually, the economy reaches normalization. The recovery tends to be slow, even during a beautiful deleveraging. It typically takes roughly 5 to 10 years for real economic activity to reach its former peak level, and it typically takes around a decade for stock prices to reach former highs, because it takes a very long time for investors to become comfortable taking the risk of holding equities again. Through the stages of these cycles, we see how people's sentiment towards fantasy and reality varies. In order for the economy to avoid debt cycles, people must care more about truth and reality to stay away from irrational exuberance.